Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Gilligan. I'm the director of the Hoover Institution, and I'd like to welcome you to the fifth and final installment of Cardinal Conversations for this academic year. Reflective of a broad-based commitment to open exchange across the university, this free speech initiative, co-sponsored by Stanford University, the Hoover Institution, and Friedman Spogli Institute for International Studies, was launched in January of 2018. The idea for this series originated with a diverse group of undergraduates with views ranging across the political spectrum, all of whom felt that more could be done to air contested issues on our campus. Our intent was to offer the Stanford community a series of thought-provoking conversations on key issues featuring some of today's leading thinkers and public intellectuals. At a time when attempts are being made by some to limit what can be discussed on university campuses, Stanford's President Mark Tessier-Lavigne, welcome Mr. President, and Provost Persis Drell signaled their commitment to free speech in their notes on the Quad blog post of November 7th, 2017, where they announced that preparations were underway for a series of discussions with well-known individuals who hold contrasting views on consequential subjects. Cardinal Conversations is a culmination of this commitment and an endeavor that will continue next year. To recap, the series has featured the following topics and speakers: Technology and Politics with Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman, Inequality and Populism with Francis Fukuyama and Charles Murray, Real and Fake News with Ann Applebaum and Ted Koppel and Jessica Lessin, Sexuality and Politics with Christina Summers and Andrew Sullivan. This evening's conversation will feature the topic, When Free Expression and Inclusion Collide, a Dilemma of the Times, and will be moderated by Stanford University Provost Persis Drell. Persis is a physicist who has served on the Stanford faculty since 2002. She's the James and Anna Marie Spilker Professor in the School of Engineering, a Professor of Materials Science and Engineering, and a Professor of Physics. She's the former Dean of the Stanford School of Engineering and the former Director of the U.S. Department of Energy's SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory at Stanford. In addition to her administrative responsibilities, she also teaches a winter quarter companion course to introductory physics each year for undergraduate students who have limited exposure to the subject in high school. Persis is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is a fellow of the American Physical Society. She has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a National Science Foundation Presidential Young Investigator Award. Our three distinguished speakers are Danielle Brown. She's Google's Vice President of Diversity, Integrity, and Governance in their people organizations. Prior to joining Google in July of 2017, Danielle was Vice President and Group Chief Human Resource Officer of Intel Corporation, where she led business-facing HR for sales, manufacturing operations, and general and administrative groups. Earlier in her career, Danielle worked as a strategy consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then spent nearly a decade in the biotech industry in sales and marketing with Abbott Laboratories and Gilead Sciences. John Etchemendy was Stanford University's 12th and longest-serving provost from 2000 to 2017, and one of the longest-serving provosts of any U.S. university. He's been on the faculty of Stanford's Department of Philosophy since 1983, prior to which he was a faculty member in the philosophy department at Princeton University. At Stanford, John has also served as the director of the Center for the Study of Language and Information and as a senior associate dean for the humanities. He is the author or co-author of 7 books and numerous articles in logic, and has been co-editor of the Journal of Symbolic Logic and on the editorial board of several other journals. Our last panelist is Claude M. Steele. He's an American social psychologist and is best known for his work on stereotype threat and its applications to minority student academic performance. His earlier work dealt with research on the self, as well as the role of self-regulation in addictive behaviors. In 2010, he released his book, Whistling Vivaldi and Other Clues to How Stereotypes Affect Us, summarizing years of research on stereotype threat and underperformance of minority students in higher education. He currently serves as a trustee of the Russell Sage Foundation and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and is a fellow for both the American Institutes for Research and the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. He served in academic leadership positions as the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost at UC Berkeley, the James Quinlan Dean for the School of Education at Stanford University, and as the 21st Provost of Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming this esteemed group to the stage.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome to our conversation tonight, When Free Expression and Inclusion Collide, a Dilemma of the Times, and many thanks to Danielle, Claude, and John for joining me. Now, many institutions, certainly Stanford, have been struggling to balance the ideals of free expression of ideas with full inclusion of people of all backgrounds and perspectives. This series, Cardinal Conversations, is to help advance the commitments that are at the heart of Stanford's research and education mission. Our commitment to the free expression of ideas, our commitment to fostering an inclusive campus culture. We believe that in research and education, breakthroughs in understanding come from considering a broad range of ideas, including those we might find really objectionable, and engaging in the rigorous testing of them through analysis, conversations, and debate. But we also believe that our strength at Stanford derives from our diversity, including backgrounds, religions, nationalities, races, genders, sexual identities, ages, physical abilities, political views, and ways of thinking. And we're only successful as an intellectual community when our discussion benefits from the entire range of diverse perspectives present. But this path that we have taken is fraught with challenges. It is extremely difficult to balance the ideals of free expression with our ideals of an inclusive community that is truly welcoming for individuals of all backgrounds and perspectives. And we thought there could be no more fitting end to our first season of Cardinal Conversations than by simply confronting this issue head on. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to take a few minutes, 5 minutes, to comment briefly on the topic of tonight's conversation, focusing on what they uniquely bring to it. And I'm going to start with John. John is the author of a piece, The Threat from Within, an article that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education that articulates how intellectual intolerance poses an existential danger to the university. John.
Thanks, Persis. So let me talk a bit let me start out actually talking a bit about that piece. That was, although it came out later on in the Chronicle of Higher Education, it really originally came out in the Stanford Report, and I wrote it just as I was stepping down as provost, and it was sort of a farewell missive to the community, I guess. And what I said in that piece was that I thought, and I still think, that the greatest threat to universities today is not the external threats, the obvious external threats that we all are certainly aware of, but rather a threat from within, and specifically the threat is that universities, Stanford and most other universities, are becoming narrower and narrower in their political and intellectual opinions, particularly with the faculty, but also with students. And I think that is the greatest threat to universities, both because of reasons I will get to in a minute, but also because it's an internal threat and it's very hard to know how to counter it. And I say in the longer Chronicle piece, I say a little bit about how I think what we need to do to counter it. But I see this as the greatest threat because I think it threatens the core of what universities stand for. And it threatens that core because it threatens the dual mission of the university, both research and teaching, and I will get to that in a bit. So as a consequence, one reaction to this threat, not the only one, but one reaction to the trend toward a narrower and narrower political and academic perspective, one reaction is that we need to reaffirm an absolutely uncompromising stance in support of free expression. So I want to talk about why I think that. Then after I explain why I think that really threatens the core of our mission, I will talk a bit about how to think about inclusion given what I've just said and given the tensions that can come up in these two somewhat competing values. So the mission of the university, or the dual mission of the modern research university, is on the one hand research, and on the other hand teaching. And these are in some sense two very different missions. On the other hand, as those of us in the university appreciate, they are extremely synergistic. And it's actually very important. It's a very good thing that in the United States, these two missions are located both in these institutions that we call universities. I could give a lecture on why I think that's important, but I won't. So the dual mission of research and teaching, let me say something first about research. And Persis has actually said a bit of what I said in the threat from within. So I think that it's important to understand that universities are not committed to any given set of doctrines. That's not what universities are all about. We're not committed to, say, the currently accepted scientific viewpoints, for example. That's not what the university is committed to as an institution. What the university is committed to is, sometimes people say, well, it's committed to truth, but even that's an oversimplification. It's really committed to a methodology. And it's a methodology that we believe, in the long run, if carried out properly, eventually trends toward truth, trends toward knowledge, gets us to where we understand and know more about the world that we live in. So this methodology, which Persis also described briefly, is a methodology of rational discourse. That is, rational discourse informed by empirical discoveries. And rational discourse it is essential to rational discourse that there be an interaction, a clash, if you will, of different views, and the idea is, and the theory is, that the best, the best, most well-supported views ultimately will win out. Maybe not immediately, but ultimately will win out. Now, the university is a unique institution in society in that it is committed to providing the platform for that methodology to play out. The university does not either commit itself to a particular set of doctrines, it also does not adjudicate the outcome of that methodology. The adjudication, the decision of, well, yes, this particular view won out, or this particular view is the right view, that's done by people at the university. That's done by researchers in the field. It is not the institution's business to say, this view is correct, this view will no longer allow people to express this view. That's not the university's role. The university's role, I sometimes say, is to be an institutional fallibilist. That's a philosophical term. So fallibilism is the view that any doctrine, however well supported, however much we believe it at any given time, any doctrine can, in theory, ultimately be demonstrated to be incorrect. And we've seen, through the history of science, we've seen many, many cases where views that were absolutely universally accepted and supported by an incredible amount of evidence eventually were overturned. I mean, think of the heliocentric universe, for example. We all know that the Earth does not move. We experience that every day. And yet, eventually, Galileo and Copernicus convinced us otherwise, right? So we have to, as an institution, maintain that fallibilistic standpoint. Now, you or individual researchers do not. I mean, you individual researchers have an obligation to argue for whatever you believe is correct and whatever your latest results are and so forth and so on. Okay, so that's essential to the functioning of the methodology that universities on the research side are committed to. So that's how it's central to the research mission, the being open to a wide range of opinions and views, indeed anything that has any chance of being rationally supported or being true. So on the teaching side, our second mission is teaching, and I think there are at least a couple of different ways in which freedom of expression, openness of expression are absolutely essential to our teaching mission. I think the first is pretty obvious. The first is students, is sort of the intellectual development of students. The intellectual development of students can only work, or works best, when they are exposed to the widest range of opinions and views, true and false, because that's how they learn to critically assess opinions, critically assess claims, how to criticize them, how to analyze them, how to refute them if they feel that they're false. That's how they learn the critical thinking that is the essential skill that they should take away from the university. What students get when they graduate from the university, if all goes well, is not, a store of true opinions. It's good if they have some true opinions, right? But that's not what's important. What's really important is their ability to think critically, to analyze arguments, to deal with claims that they will encounter throughout their lives and have to deal with. So that's the first way. So it's essential that we keep open to a broad range of opinions, true and false, in order to promote the intellectual development of our students. But what we do at the university is not just intellectual development. There's also a kind of amazing emotional development, maturing that happens at a university, particularly in the undergraduate years, so not only. We take in students coming directly from high school, and they are basically high school students. They're very young. And our role is to produce adults who are capable of being contributing members of society, who are capable of navigating the world, who are capable of contributing to the civil discourse in society. Now, that requires a kind of maturation that is really amazing to watch. And I think that it's in many ways, we play a very, very big role in that maturation. Now, in that emotional development, so I talked about intellectual development, I think this is emotional development, the university's responsibility is not to protect students, not to protect them from, for example, upsetting ideas that they may encounter at the university, but to equip them to know how to respond to that, to know how to deal with that, to know how to assess the claims that they may find objectionable, that they may find abhorrent. So let me use an analogy. Probably the most common way in which undergraduate students are emotional difficulty that undergraduate students encounter at a university, the most common, is homesickness. Okay, so imagine that we could somehow or other protect them from homesickness. Maybe we could figure out a way of delivering our education to their homes so they would never have to leave their households, never have to leave their parents, and we could just provide them with that education. Would this be a good thing? No, it would be a terrible thing, right? We are to equip them so that they can deal with that homesickness, which is a real phenomenon, a real upsetting experience, to deal with that so that as they move out into the world, they are equipped to handle it. I think that the importance of exposing them to different views that they have not encountered before, views that they find even shocking, views that they even find sort of personal affronts, because they need to be prepared and understand how to deal with them so that when they go out into the world, they are also properly prepared. So I see this freedom of expression, openness to a broad range of ideas as essential to the entire mission of the university, both teaching and research. Okay, how about inclusion? Okay, okay, how about inclusion? Let me say a few words about inclusion. First, let me say more generally, inclusion is, we have a lot of values at the university other than the value of free expression, many different values. Some of those values conflict with or come into conflict with free expression. Some of those values don't. For example, we value integrity. Integrity is actually contributes to, it's an essential part of our research and teaching mission. Let me use another analogy rather than talk immediately about integrity, and that is, how about the value that we place on civility, civil conversation, civil interaction. We, of course, value not just discourse, rational discourse, but it would be nice if it's civil, right? But it's not always going to be. Heated conversations get heated. There are going to be cases where a conversation, an interlocutor is not civil, and when push comes to shove, we need to protect the right of the speaker to speak rather than try to buy civility by silencing some members of the community. That is not the way to achieve civility. So, because free expression is so central to the core of what universities do, we have to sometimes give up our valuing of civility. I think the same is true of inclusion. Now, mind you, the way in which free expression conflicts with inclusion is not in making us an actually less inclusive institution, but in making some individuals feel that they aren't included, that they're not a full part of the university. We have to find a way to communicate to those individuals that the fact that other individuals in the community, other speakers that come from outside the community, the fact that they don't all agree with you, the fact that they say things that really upset you, even perhaps question your right to be there, that does not mean you don't have a right to be there. That does not mean you are not a full member of the community. Okay, I could go on, talk about hate speech, but I'm going to leave that to the question.
So now let me go to Claude, and great segue, because Claude, you've written this monumental work. You invented the concept of stereotype threat. Give us your thoughts, because it seems that the educational function of the university is actually a little bit threatened by some of the things that John has put forth.
Well, one of our big anxieties has been that we're going to agree too much.
We've known each other so long.
Yeah, it's been a long time. And I thought many of the things you just said, I heartily agree with. So I've decided to take a tact here, which is to try to put this discussion of free speech and inclusion in a context, a different context, a context that I find myself these days thinking about it more and more in relation to a particular context. And that context starts with a fact that I think we may underappreciate, which is that our society is in an important way under transition, under demographic transition, if I might put it that way. For example, in 1970, about 81% of the United States population was white. Today, that's about 65, 64%. By 2040, it's going to be less than half. By 2050, there's a trend there. And I think it's a trend that pressures certain things. One thing in particular is that it means that our institutions, like our universities, our schools, our workplaces, will have to deal with a much greater diversity of people, participants, than maybe they were originally designed to deal with or originally conceived of themselves as dealing with. And this diversity, it's important to point out, isn't just an anodyne kind of diversity where people are slightly different from each other, but basically just beneath the surface where we're all the same. It is bringing together in these institutions people who have had very different, from groups that have had very different experiences in this nation, across the history of this nation. I think that fact about diversity is something that we need to, in thinking about this question, bring to light. It brings together people for whom I think might quite rationally be vigilant to these situations, and maybe even sometimes that vigilance will move into mistrust as a default assumption. And by mistrust, I mean mistrust that this institution is really going to be trustworthily committed to my welfare, to have my back, to see me develop in the best possible ways. Is it going to be that kind of institution for me? And when I come from a group that has had a very complex history in this society, I think it's rational to have that kind of concern. And so I think that spells out a particular challenge that we have in all of our institutions. We're concerned here about the corporate world and the university world, but I think it's in all of our institutions the same kind of phenomenon exists. We have had a certain model for thinking about this, which is that if we thought about people as individuals, that we can, and that we have the intent not to discriminate and to not do this, that would be enough of an offer that people could trust it. But I think over the years, this was certainly the hope. I think I'm old enough to remember the 1960s when a lot of movement toward integration happened. Supreme Court decisions that integrated our schools, civil rights bills that integrated public facilities and the like. There was at the time a certain hope and optimism, I certainly shared it, that we had to open the door and things would be okay because we could function in a kind of colorblind, identity-blind way and trust that people would more or less assimilate to the mainstream, and that model of functioning would be okay to deliver us to the place that we'd like to be delivered to. That, I think, though, may seem especially in the light of this moment and in light of our experience as a society in the meantime, maybe a bit of a naive model for how to think about how diversity might work. After all, we are a society that from its beginnings has used identity as a way of engineering advantage for some and disadvantage for others. That's a fact of our life. That's a part of our structure as a society. And as Faulkner says, the past is not all in the past. There are legacies of that, and there are structures in place. I just went through a symposium in Memphis on the commemoration of Martin Luther King's assassination, and I heard panels of lawyers, civil rights lawyers, talking about the things that they struggle with on a daily basis in almost every walk of life that disadvantage groups based on identity. So as students, faculty, as members of our community come onto a campus, can they, if they're members of these groups, just ignore all that and say, no, I'm gonna take you at your word, that your intentions are completely sufficient, you're a good person, and I trust you. And when things happen that are ambiguous and frustrating, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt because I trust you. That's what we're asking, in a sense, in the use of that old model. And I think we can see that it would be psychologically challenging for a person to do that. I also think other students, for example, other faculty, students, other members of our community might be a better term, see this struggle, see this legacy of our history, and want to get past it, want to do things that will get us past this. And they can develop an impatience, sometimes I think as having been the target of it, a ruthlessness, about pressing for progress in these ways. Other students, as we know, can feel threatened by the whole enterprise. That they can feel, well, all that's well and good. I'm not opposed to that, but who's here speaking for my interests and for who's got my back? They can feel a bit of identity threat in this mix that we currently have in our institutions. So I think that's the context into which I increasingly think about the issue of free speech and inclusion. And one can see that I hope from that description of the context how free speech and certainly some uses of it can be incredibly disruptive to people and to their functioning in our institution, in our situation. It can be debilitating enough as to make it very difficult for them to really take advantage of the opportunities here, the developmental opportunities, the learning opportunities. It can affect their performance. It can affect even the decisions they make about the course of their lives, the kind of careers they want to be part of. It's gauged on how much of this kind of pressure they might feel. So in this American project, which we should pat ourselves on the back for having a project which aspires to having an integrated, fair society for all people, this is, I think, a foundational challenge, is meeting this issue of trust. And so whereas I almost letter for letter agree with the way John just spelled out the case for free speech, and I genuinely mean that. I can't imagine having a first-class university in which anything less than that is the commitment of the institution. That has to be our basic commitment. But I think in recognizing the reality of trying to bring in a diversity of people who've had very different experiences in our society for a long, long period of time, in recognizing that reality, I think we have to do a lot to instill trust and to show that community that we are committed to everybody in the community understanding the importance of this project, understanding the challenges that go into this project that are necessary to meet in order to have a successfully diverse society. I think if there's any fault we have at this point in our history, it is maybe relying too long on the notion that we could just passively, in a laissez-faire way, let this situation take care of itself. I think to make real progress at this point, we have to do the things that will instill in our communities a sense of trust that this is an important issue, goal, and though we have a commitment to institutionally defining values like free speech and open discussions and all of that, that we also understand their circumstances and that we're, as an institution, proactively doing things that would help achieve that. So that's the way I would come down.
I thank you, Claude. I find your words quite inspiring, actually, and present some challenges that I think we will take up. But I'd like now to go to Danielle, because you're out in the real world, and you hear us struggling with how do we prepare our students for that real world, and what is your view on this?
Well, thank you, and thanks everybody. It's great to be here and participate in this dialogue, which is really a conversation for our times. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of ways that a company like Google is similar to a college campus, and also ways that we're different, and sort of how we think about this. And I think first it's important to start with something I think about a lot and talk about a lot, which is, any company of Google's size, just like any campus of Stanford's size, is really a microcosm of society. And so any issue that society at large is grappling with, we're going to grapple with it too on our campuses and in our workplaces. And I think a lot of times, we think, oh, maybe this is just a debate or an argument limited to a campus. Well, no, it's not. We're attracting and hiring the talent of tomorrow. And if we don't figure out how to deal with this on a college campus, we're going to have to deal with it in our workforces. And it's something that we're actively thinking about all the time, and we know we need to build some capability around. You know, Google as a company was certainly founded on principles around information and exchange of information and free ideas. And so the concept of free speech is something that we've held dear really since our inception and our founding. It's something that we talk a lot about as a really core value and principle of our culture. At the same time, we've been really clear that the principles of diversity and inclusion are something that we also hold dear, that we're really committed to, that we're certainly striving to improve upon. And I think a lot about, you know, can these principles sort of coexist? Can you have this principle and commitment to free speech? And can you have this principle that you hold dear around diversity and inclusion? And can you hold these both at the same time when they do inherently come into conflict? And my hypothesis is that you can, but you can't do it unless we build some capability and build some muscle and offer our employees some tools with which to grapple with these concepts together. And I'll talk about what I think those tools or those capabilities or those skills are that we need to invest in building. You know, I will say that many of the students on Stanford's campus and many of the other college campuses around our country will become future Googlers or work in the tech industry. And, you know, as we look for talent, you know, we want Googlers who can engage in discussion and debate, have robust exchanges of ideas, who can make critical arguments and bring multiple perspectives to their work, because we know that's going to produce better products and better ideas. And we also want Googlers who believe in the principles and the values that we hold dear around respect for one another, around the value that diversity brings to our workforce, that diversity is actually an asset, and who foster inclusion and belonging. And maybe a slight departure from a college campus, you know, as we think about all this, we also have a business to run. And so we have to think about, you know, what is a productive discourse to have in the workplace? What helps us move our business forward? You know, what are the right conversations to be having at work, and how does that all fit together? And so for us, at a time when things are so polarized, and they are, I think we can all admit that, at a time, you know, where folks are divided and we're having these debates, you know, how do we bridge this divide? And we've been thinking about tools, or again, skills and capabilities that we want to build to help bridge that divide and help these principles coexist. And I think of these four sort of big things that we've been thinking about. I think the first is an investment in building the skill of empathy, being able to walk in the other's shoes, being able to understand somebody else's lived experience and perspectives. And while you might not agree, you know, agreement isn't what we're going for. It's about empathy, it's about understanding, it's about being willing to listen and learn and seek perspective. I think there is a skill we need to build, or a tool we need to equip folks with around resilience too. In the course of a long and successful career, there are going to be many people you encounter that you aren't going to agree with, that you're going to learn from and that you're going to debate with, and that's going to help you strengthen or build a skill or an argument or a product. And we do want to build that skill of resilience in our talent, to be able to take a lot of ideas in and handle them, and not let those things that you disagree with or harm you, you know, break you, but actually help build you up and make you stronger. I also think we have to really invest in and double down in the concept of respect in our workplaces, and respect for the other, respect for us all as like fully human and all the different aspects of that humanness we bring. It's something we're making a lot of investments in, which I'm happy to talk about. And finally, I think building a skill and capability around allyship is really important during polarized times. I will acknowledge that when you are underrepresented in a community, in a college campus or in a workplace, when you're marginalized, it can be really, really exhausting to come in every day and have to fight for your humanity or defend your humanity. And a lot of these free speech debates, you know, as we read about them, It's students who really feel very attacked and very unsafe, and like their humanity is being called into question, and that they always have to defend that. And that can be pretty exhausting when you're coming every day and you're underrepresented and marginalized, and you feel like you have to just defend your place to belong or your right to belong every day. And so I think investing in allyship, right? Having people who can use their voice and speak for you and support you when times are tough, when things are polarized, having people who are willing to be accomplices in making change and speaking for you and representing you is really important as well. So those are sort of the big four that we're really thinking about: empathy, resilience, respect, and lastly, allyship. You know, I'll leave you with one idea that sort of struck with me as I was preparing for the conversation today. I did a ton of reading, lots of listening. There's all sorts of great reading out there and great podcasts talking about this very issue. And I got this, I want to quote the author. So I read this over the weekend, actually. It was an op-ed in the Washington Post written by Suzanne Nossel, who's the CEO of an organization dedicated to free speech. And I thought this resonated, and it's worth us thinking about a little bit. It was that one of the greatest and most often overlooked dangers to free speech on campus is that it will become associated exclusively with those who aim to offend. And if that's the case, we'll create a generation of students and then young workers who become alienated from the principle of free speech, and who believe that the protections of free speech and the First Amendment don't apply to them. And I think that is something that we really do need to think about, is that the principle of free speech really can apply to, it does apply to everybody, and it's important for everybody. And we need to think about how to make sure it extends to something that everybody values, and that I think we've got some work to do.
Oh, thank you. Lots of interesting themes in there to pursue. Perhaps one of them that I want to start with is it's heartening to hear your faith in a rational world on all of your parts, but the internet is upon us. Social media are upon us. I guess that's a plural. And it's a different world. And social media weaponizes free expression in a way that we didn't have to deal with before. And so I'd just like to challenge each of you on that topic, or one or the other if you'd like to take it up, because it feels to me that weaponization is encouraging the kind of thing you were talking about, Danielle, about deliberately offensive speech, and it's also then being used to doxing and other strategies. And you know, at a certain point, those are doing damage. So do we just say we can ignore that? Is there a limit? Anybody want to take that challenge up?
I'll say something about
Go for it, John.
I think that it's important to understand that what the university is committed to is rational discourse and the freedom to express propositional content that then is supported and then perhaps attacked and so forth and so on, that is debated in some way or other. A lot of what you refer to is really not that. It's not that in a couple of ways. One is, it's not that because it makes no claims. So, for example, a racial epithet does not make a claim, right? It's not something that is defended or, you know, is asserting something about the world. A swastika painted on a wall is not an assertion. I don't think that universities have any commitment. I think we need to model the kind of rational discourse that we think is important. We as a university, we as academics, and we need to model that. And it will be different. It will be perceived to be different from the kinds of things that sometimes happen on the internet, or often happen on the internet. And then we have to teach our students, just as we have to teach ourselves, how to be resilient in the face of those kinds of attacks. I have certainly been attacked publicly, and you have to get used to it.
I could follow up with a question. Are you thinking that the university's commitment to free speech, we're pretty comfortable with that when we're talking about a scholarly, scientific setting of some sort? There, it's pretty easy, but that our responsibility for free speech weakens or goes away as it's outside of a scholarly context. It's still on campus, but it is a swastika on the wall, or it's a slur on the internet. Are you?
I think so. I think it's a range. Okay, I think a swastika on the wall is something that the university can prevent if possible. Do everything it can to stop people from doing abhorrent things like that, or racial epithets, without compromising its values. And then, of course, rational discourse, one should not, even if you object to the views being expressed. Now, there's a lot that goes between those two, all the way to, there are clearly people out there that are provocateurs. Provocateurs are not, they make claims which they intend to be provocative. They don't really intend to support them. They don't really perhaps expect people to believe them. They expect them to be shocking. They expect them to be hurtful. Now, I think that there is a question about whether, what to do about provocateurs, because they're moving down that scale toward the swastika rather than toward the rational expression of a view. But because freedom of expression is so important to what we do, we have to bend over backwards not to draw the line at the wrong place. So I actually think that we need to, grin and bear it when a provocateur comes to campus and say, yes, I do not think that particular person is trying to advance knowledge in any way, is trying to support his or her views in any way. But I, as an institutional, as a president or provost or whoever, cannot risk shutting them down and silencing them. Because once you silence that person, you silence the next person and the next person, and pretty soon you really are violating our core values. So I don't know if that's an answer.
Yeah, I try to think of an example, and one that I guess we've been through as an institution is Charles Murray and his invitation, I guess, to this forum. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that. What do I feel about that? Because I'm not, I confess there's a background here. I'm a psychologist, and psychology has in its history this pseudoscience that has originated in the 19th century as a way of rationalizing slavery and other lack of women's suffrage and the like, by pointing to genetic bases of differences in intelligence being rooted in differences in genetics, which gives the difference a kind of permanence that would make it reasonable to have these inequalities that I'm pointing to. So that's been a project in America, and psychologists have been, because we've generated a lot of the methodologies used, we've been in that. And I remember as a graduate student many years ago, before there was Charles Murray, there was Arthur Jensen, and then there was William Shockley, and there's a number of people who've had this view, and I can remember the distress of being told in graduate school that I should go to hear Arthur Jensen, because that's what being a scientist involves doing. And I did go. But I found that very painful to endure that. I have similar feelings about Charles Murray and the bell curve and the same arguments. So I do empathize with the resistance to, geez, do we have to do that? How far do we go in preserving? And how much are you asking me to do? When I need to know that you're even committed to having me here. At the same time, I'm wrestling with that. I'm being asked to do something that really is, it's tough to hear that. This person who casually talks about the inferiority of you, your family, and your race, and your gender. So I get the pain of that. So I thought about, well, what would I do? Well, if the psychology department was thinking of, that I'm in, was thinking of inviting Charles Murray, it would be easy for me to just vote no, because I don't think, we could have a separate conversation about this, it probably warrants that, but I don't think enough of his methods, scholarship, he's not a refereed contributor to this, even to this set of ideas. So I don't, and there's really nothing new in the arguments. There's not a new insight there. There's not new levels of evidence. So I would say no. But if some student group across campus, for example, invited him, I wouldn't oppose that. And I think I wouldn't oppose it on the same grounds that you just laid out. But I do think that the institution has to have as much of a commitment to my situation as it does to that principle, because I think that is, I don't see one as having a greater importance than the other. I see them both having indispensable importance, because I believe that is what is required of a humane position in this enterprise, is that we be every bit as committed to the securing of that person's experience in the institution. And otherwise, we're not offering them the same institution. We're offering them an institution that's fraught with personal threat on an ongoing basis, and they're paying a much higher price for that free speech than anybody else is paying for it, and that's not kosher.
So Claude, I come down in exactly the same place you do. That is, I have no compunction if a group wants to invite a speaker or wants not to invite a speaker. So the psychology department, if they decide not to, this person's not of interest. We think this person is not, not really serious. The views are not important, are not well supported, have been refuted before. Then they have no obligation to invite that person. So I have no problem with saying, no, we're not going to invite that person. It's different if there is a group on campus, another group on campus that decides they want to hear that view and they want to hear those arguments. Shutting that down is what I would object to. Okay.
I join you there.
I think that in the case of Charles Murray, I think it's a good example because Charles Murray is, I would not classify him as a provocateur. I think he certainly is trying, and he has written some things that are quite insightful. The stuff he writes on IQ, I think, are absolutely, positively refutable, and they have been refuted. And it's not clear why that is not more broadly known. But what tends to happen is that students, often urged on by faculty, exaggerate his views. Try to classify him as a white supremacist. He is not a white supremacist. He does, in the bell curve, give an argument. He actually gives the evidence that refutes his own view about the genetic basis of IQ. I could go into that, but I won't. So, it's interesting that has not been expressed more loud enough that people don't hear that. What they hear instead is a caricature of him as an evil person who's, more like Milo Yiannopoulos or something.
Danielle, did you want to say anything on this before I go to the next question?
I had a whole thing about social media, but I think we got off of that. Maybe I will talk a little bit about sort of how you extend a debate like this into social media and the dangers of that and the pitfalls, because I do think it's an interesting thing that, again, we're really grappling with as tech companies, that I think is interesting. Like here we're disagreeing, we're having a robust debate, we're having like a deep level of discourse, and I think there is that civility, there's that mutual respect, there's that trust, it works. It's very hard to have any of those conditions in under 300 characters online, or when you're flinging something into the ether to strangers on the internet. And I do think that where we're having a lot of these polarized debates right now that are just utterly unproductive and unfruitful is on social media, which has become a very toxic and polarized place. Certainly, again, that's not helping any of us. And I do think what's interesting is some of this notion of free speech on the internet has very real consequences. And I think that's important to note as somebody who's encountered and dealt with a fair amount of internet harassment herself. It's not just mobs of Twitter trolls and bots descending on you, which is certainly unpleasant and, if it's the first time you've encountered it, quite scary. But it extends to things that become physical threats, doxing and swatting and death threats. Those are very real sort of things that arise from, again, people, under the guise of free speech, can become very real physical threats to one's safety. And I think that's worth thinking about too, right? Is this free speech, while it's welcome, while it's important, it can have consequences beyond just hurting my feelings. Luckily I have a pretty thick skin, and I've grown a pretty thick skin, and I realize the consequences of putting yourself out there and having an opinion as a woman on the internet. But I do want to say that these things do have consequences that we ought to think about, whether it's somebody's physical safety on campus, whether it's somebody's physical or psychological safety online. And I think that is important to remember as we have this debate about the limitations of free speech and how we want to think about it in the context of our campus or our workplace. So sorry I took us a little off topic.
No,
No,
that's
no.
I was
right
trying
on
to bring us
topic,
back.
Yeah.
So we're going to go to the question session in a few minutes, and then I think they'll put a slide up that tells you how to ask questions on Slido, so it'll let you log on your device and then send in questions. But while that's coming up, I have one last question that I'd like to ask, and it goes actually to our institutions. We've talked a lot about free speech and inclusion, but there are many who perceive both of our institutions as actually, and in fact you called this out as one of your concerns, John, as not being so open to diverse ideas as we might be. There's a great line from John's piece I'm going to quote. "When we encounter an argument whose conclusions we disbelieve, we feel compelled to muster our analytical powers to find the flaws. We question the assumptions, examine the methodology, analyze the reasoning. But when faced with an argument whose conclusions we agree, we tend to be more lenient, we may tolerate questionable assumptions, and overlook flaws in the reasoning." And essentially, John, when you wrote that, I heard you hinting that actually, maybe even more than hinting, in the academy, our assessments of quality might be tending to favor those with views similar to our own. And so therefore, whether it's in the academy, or I'm going to start by asking Danielle whether this happens in Google, we actually have developed cultures where that line, you draw your line, there's an asymmetry, a political asymmetry to where the lines are drawn. And so I'd like to ask Danielle how that plays out at Google, what you see are the negatives associated or positives associated with that, and then see if Claude and John want to comment on that.
So certainly I think that, again, a lot of companies are grappling with, have we become sort of hotbed of groupthink, or an echo chamber, if you will, and you hear a lot about that. And I think that is dangerous for a number of reasons, and certainly, not a good thing in general. And again, when I think about the solution to this and the tools we need to build, it really is around building that empathy, building that respect for one another, building resilience, building allyship. Those are skills that I think perhaps we have underinvested in, which has sort of gotten us to where we are and have given rise to some of the challenges that we're grappling with. How do we tolerate people with different points of view? How do we listen with an open mind and debate and discuss? It is an issue that we're grappling with that is very difficult and very challenging.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, another way of putting that is that there's a confirmation bias that can take over and become an echo in a small group, and I think a lot of breakthroughs in even the most sophisticated science come from people bringing in different perspectives, as much as people having a high level of rarefied skill, maybe even. That people look at the problem a different way, they have a different interest in the problem, want to put it to a different use. These kinds of things which come from diversity, and you're basically making in that quote a rationale for diversity, for different perspectives. So I think that is that's how these two things kind of support each other in a sense. That you would if you didn't have free speech, you would repress that diversity. And that diversity, and you repress that diversity, you're going to make problem solving and much less effective. I look at my field of psychology, and when I came into it, it was, like many fields at the time, a predominantly male enterprise. And we had a certain focus and a certain set of norms and ways of thinking about things and valuing certain quantitative approaches to problems that in our world seem so compelling to us. But then psychology did get more diverse, and in particular women came in and looked at some of those same problems very differently, had different interests, brought in different problems, even different methodologies. And so the diversity of identity greatly expanded the reach of the science. And I don't think that's uncommon. I think that's probably historically a trend, in that one of the strengths of American society has been that we've had so many cultures and peoples to draw on, that we've enjoyed that benefit without necessarily crediting it, but we've enjoyed the benefit of diversity for a good while. So I do see that as, I agree with John yet again, that is an incredibly important thing, and that confirmation bias in a small, homogeneous group is bad on every dimension.
So Claude, I mean, I have actually used you as an example over and over and over again of the importance of diversity, and how you get views that you would not, and views and discoveries and insights that you would not get otherwise. And I think stereotype threat is one of the major psychological discoveries of the latter half of the 20th century. And it's interesting that while I was
For that later, that's
while I was provost,
yeah.
I think we probably appointed 10 or 15 people all around the university, in the business school, in the education school, sociology, law school, whose field was at least in part stereotype threat. And this, so that just shows how important that view and that theory has been to the academy, and it never would have happened were the academy had it not been diversified, because it's not something that we would otherwise notice. Now, this quote that Persis read, one of the things I want to emphasize is that difference in our reaction to things that we agree and things that we disagree with is natural. It's not something evil. It's something that's very natural. It happens when we're little kids, and if you find, the surprising fact is the thing that you explore and try to figure out what's going on. I didn't expect that. And it's the conclusions that you disagree with, that you're epistemologically, it's incumbent upon you to either figure out what went wrong with that argument or accept the conclusion and change your own view. And that's hard to do. So this is why there is a natural tendency toward homogeneity in academia. And that worries me, and that's one of the reasons that I say that the threat from within is the most dangerous threat to academia of all, because it's what we do naturally.
Can I suggest maybe a possible anecdote to some of this as you talk about any institution that sort of has sameness, right? Are we becoming an echo chamber or something? It always goes back to something I say a lot in my line of work, which is representation matters, right? A lot of Silicon Valley tech companies sort of grew up as a tight circle of friends, right? Coming from a very small, select group of schools with a set of shared values and worldviews and perspectives. And it's not surprising that over time, a lot of those people had similar views and similar perspectives and similar values. And I do think if you want to avoid that sameness, that groupthink, if you want to be able to bring in those diverse perspectives, representation really matters. You talked about the field of psychology and how the body of work grew and got more robust over time when you added more women to the field. Certainly for a lot of Silicon Valley tech companies, Google's no different. We have an underrepresentation of women technologists, of women and men of color in our workforce. That's something that we're actively working to correct, because we know that representation matters and it leads to a better dialogue, a better discourse, better products. So I think that is an anecdote that we all ought to think about, is what representation don't we have on our college campus, in our workforces, and how can solving that problem help us solve some of these challenges?
Okay, we have 35 questions, and we're just going to do bang, 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 okay? Because I'd really like to get through as many as we can, and just to the audience, I'm going to be combining a couple of them, if you'll forgive me, just so we can get through as many different topics as possible. So I'm going to start with John. This is 2 questions combined. Are there situations where diversity is not an asset? If not, should institutions be more inclusive to those with below average intelligence, criminal records, and other such features? And that's a similar question. Isn't discrimination inclusion central to functioning markets, organization? Stanford excludes on the basis of intelligence, criminal record, countless other attributes. Should Stanford be inclusive of people who will counteract their goals? John.
Ooh. Yeah,
I'm glad
I'm
you
so
got
glad
that.
they're answering these questions. They're terrific questions.
they're wonderful questions. It's a wonderful question. And so I do think that the importance of inclusion goes beyond our sort of standard categories of diversity, including criminal record. We do, in fact, we do admit students who have criminal backgrounds, but we have to be convinced that they have in fact reformed and that they're not going to cause a problem in the community and so forth. And they bring, extremely important insights and life stories. So I think that's true. Now, I think that there's different things to be said about, we end up teaching a very intellectually, I guess, fairly homogeneous in the sense of ability. And that, in some ways, is because of the role we play in the overall ecology of higher education. I think that it's absolutely important that higher education serve every member of society that it can be served. But so there are complexities there that I don't have time to go into. But one thing that I want to mention is there was a study recently that showed that students going to college, their tolerance for diversity increases immensely during 4 years in college for diversity of ethnicity, racial diversity, religious diversity, diversity of sexual preference, and so forth and so on. Tolerance increases. Tolerance for political diversity decreases. People become less tolerant of people who disagree with them politically. This is, now you might think, well, this is just proof that, universities indoctrinate kids to be more liberal, but no, it's actually on both sides. On both sides, the toleration decreases. A little bit more on the liberal progressive side than on the conservative side, but people become less tolerant, and that really, really concerns me. And I don't know, one of the things that, maybe it's because I'm a political moderate, I don't know. One of the things that I think people need to understand is that very few people in the world are evil. And if they have views that look so contrary to your deeply held views, and you can't understand why, you maybe need to understand them better. And then you would at least either understand perhaps the plausibility of their views, or at least the reason for their views. And we're not teaching that.
So the next two questions are also related, and they go to Claude, although I do believe they were intended for you, Danielle, which is, in light of Professor Etchemendy's argument that a point of view expressed with reasoned arguments, this just moved on me, should be allowed and at least tolerated, please address the James Danmore memo and consequences at Google. And the second one, can you discuss the James Danmore case and how diversity and freedom of speech were balanced in his firing from Google? So would you like to take that one, Claude?
That seems really
And I can say why I can't
Okay.
take it, yeah. So not trying to be unhelpful here, but because there's active litigation pending, I really can't talk too much about the specific case, as I'm sure you can appreciate.
I'm going to cop out because I may not know enough about that particular case to render an intelligible answer.
Okay, so then we'll go on to the next one.
Okay.
For you, are safe spaces antithetical to free speech and instead conducive to echo chambers?
Safe space, echo chambers. Got a vocabulary going here. They certainly can be echo chambers. They can drift into that. I don't know how to police that. I do think, so I'll go up a couple thousand feet in trying to answer that. I do think in principle there can be some real value in safe spaces, or at least places where people can have a bit of repose from some of the stresses that we're talking about. I think that the whole discussion should keep in mind the history of the United States and the roles that identity have played there, and people's feelings about that, and the like. So if you don't keep that in mind, the idea of a safe space can sometimes just seem like an adolescent indulgence. Spoiled kids, snowflakes, can't function in relation. But if you think a little bit more broadly about where we are as a society and where we're trying to move as a society, the project that we're engaged in in a judicious way, trying to integrate a society that has given its members very different experiences. If you think about it that way, I think you can have a bit more compassion for the need on a Friday afternoon or something to have a little relaxation away from those pressures. Now, if that is in the student culture, for example, all by itself, with no other opportunities for people to have cross-group contact and genuine engagement with each other, that would not be good. But I think in thinking about this larger project that I just referred to, we have to have that kind of balance, that both opportunities are there. And sometimes I don't think we do as good a job as we could at enabling people to talk to each other across identity lines in kind of non-threatening contexts. I just heard a project at the University of Virginia, which has been certainly rocked by the crisis in Charlottesville, of having freshmen, as they come in, have a lunch buddy program where people just talk to different kinds of people. It's structured so that They don't just talk to the roommate who went to the high school they went to, and they stay throughout the whole 4 years in a friendship network that really isn't penetrated by any other experience. But they have structured in opportunities to get to know each other. We've actually done research on that. It has powerful effects on people's whole lives. Their comfort in society, the range of social movement they have, the cognitive resources they have to bring to these challenges can benefit from that. And I think as universities, we have an opportunity to do more in that regard than we do. So certainly the vocabulary these days, echo chambers, safe spaces, those things sound really like spoiled indulgences. And I have experienced them that way, and sometimes have been infuriated by that. But I would wind up just repeating what I said. I think we need a balanced approach to that kind of to our
I have a thought on
experience.
that. I sometimes think that the concept of safe space is used somewhat pejoratively, right? To sort of say, oh, these are spoiled brats or whatever. I do think if you up-level a little and maybe get rid of the word or the term safe spaces, what people are really asking for sometimes is support, tools for support. I talked earlier about, when you are underrepresented in a community or you feel marginalized or you have to come and defend your humanity every day. Having people who understand what you're going through and can provide that support and that allyship where you can have open conversation about how you're experiencing something or feeling something isn't a bad thing. And I think sometimes we've got to be a little careful about saying, what is this really intended to do? Is it intended to provide support at a time where things are polarized, where you do want to have this open and free debate and exchange of ideas that sometimes does cause real harm? And so I always encourage us to think about, before we jump to the pejorative use or assume that people can't handle something, doesn't mean you can't handle it. Also might mean that you need some support to be able to handle it in a thoughtful way and be resilient.
John, you want to?
Yeah, I just want to say something. I see some people from student affairs here, and I want to say something about what a wonderful job they do doing exactly this, providing support for students and a supportive atmosphere that I think helps them deal with the difficult things that they do deal with when they hear things that upset them and so forth. And I think one thing that people don't appreciate, particularly people in Washington, there's a lot of criticism that universities are spending more and more money on staff and so forth and so on. Well, if you have an institution that has diversified, and you're dealing with a much more diverse set of students, and you want them to succeed, how do we achieve a 95% graduation rate? It's not because we have a lot of faculty and you can throw more faculty, it's not going to give you a higher graduation rate. It's because we have the support structures, the student affairs staff that provide the kind of support that allows our students to succeed. And when you go to other universities that don't have that support structure, they don't invest in that, quote, non-academic side, you'll see graduation rates of 50%, 40%, even 30%, and that's why.
So I've gone down a bit to find a question that I think is really good one for you, Danielle, which is, since schools and tech campuses have liberal echo chambers, what steps have you taken to foster conservative viewpoints?
Certainly, I think there's work that I myself have made a concerted effort to do to get out of my own echo chamber and spend time with people whose beliefs are different than mine. And I think a lot of our leaders have done that. I think we spend a lot of time sort of working on coalition building. How do you get unlikely groups of people together to find common ground? And I'll just give you an example. Recently, we launched an interfaith network, bringing people of all sorts of different beliefs sort of together, from, traditional people that are the Christian group at Google, as well as our Jewish group at Google, and our Muslims and our atheists and agnostics. And, that's a very unique way, I think, to bring people with very different viewpoints together, find common ground in their faith, have conversations. So we're trying to foster things like that. It's something that I'm making a personal commitment to, that, at times it's uncomfortable for me, but I realize how important it is in my job to be able to spend time with people of different views. And so I think thinking about coalitions and finding common ground is really important. Sometimes I think a way to do that is to find common ground in our work that we do. So it doesn't always have to be that we come in and fight about political beliefs, for example, every day, but finding common ground in the products that we create or the services we provide, and maybe starting from there to build that foundational trust and that foundational respect that's sometimes missing when you jump right into a very heated political debate, for example, is a good way to do it.
So next question, you've all mentioned the need for critical assessment of others. It's important to self-assess too. Could you give an example of a substantive issue where someone you politically disagree with changed your mind? Why and what did you learn, John?
Okay, I'm going to throw out something that is going to perhaps shock some people in the Stanford community. But I have done a lot of thinking and a lot of talking to people who oppose gun control as a way of preventing the kinds of things that the mass shootings at high schools. And I think that there are good arguments that most of the gun control legislation that we have proposed, or that has any realistic chance of passing, will have no effect. I mean, it's interesting, if you look at the various instances, not a single one of them would be prevented by either the current or proposed legislation. And then the question is, can the country go beyond that and do things that are much stronger than the currently proposed gun control legislations, and do what Australia did, take away guns or so forth. And I think that the conclusion I've come to is that that is not going to happen in the United States. And perhaps for good reason, perhaps for bad reason, but it's not going to happen. And so I end up on the gun control debate, shockingly, not really a supporter of most of the proposals. I think there are some that are obvious, like mandatory background checks and so forth. But, and that comes from talking to people who are opposed to gun control. So yes, and I didn't, believe me, that's not where I started.
Claude, should universities be inclusive to those who disregard empiricism, the scientific methods, and other tools of civil discourse?
No.
That was a speed round question.
Trying to think of how I could change my answer there or elaborate in a way that would be more intelligible, I suppose. But that's a long list of I don't know why they'd want to be here if they have that set of viewpoints, that level of closed-mindedness. But I suppose, as an educator, I'd like to believe that, especially when I think about graduates, the kind of relationship faculty have with graduate students, where you can get to know them and you're a mentor, and you want to help people see the value of what you do and the value of being disciplined, as in the term academic discipline, of being disciplined about thinking and evaluating facts, data, and the like. So that a person with all those predilections might be a case that's you'd worry whether you could ever reach them. But I think on a relatively regular basis, part of our mission is to convey the value and importance of the university's mission. What a university is about, what knowledge gathering and processing is about, and the value of that. So I wouldn't want to exclude people who don't yet appreciate that. I'd want to take that on as part of our responsibility, even. Although a person like that might be very difficult to be hopeful about.
I'm looking down for the next question that looks good for you, Danielle. Do you think social media is changing the way we think and reducing critical analysis?
Sadly, yes. And again, I think it goes back to Is it a forum where you can really go deep on conversations? Is it a place where you can really have robust debate? Is it encouraging us to find people like us on the internet and just have those discussions with those people? And I do see real challenges that are presented with it. That said, I don't know that the challenges are insurmountable, but I think right now we're grappling with, or in the thick of those challenges that we're having, and I named a few earlier. I've definitely seen, I think, the chilling effect that can happen when you put ideas out there and, again, have very real threats to safety, certainly. I've seen that social media can tend to divide us. I think we've all seen that play out. Again, I think that companies are getting smarter to how those things are happening and how those things are playing out, and actively seeking out solutions. I don't think anybody built these tools and these platforms intending for them to be so divisive. And I think we're really thinking about that now. What responsibility do these companies have to use their tools as constructs for good, to build community, build coalitions, bring people together? I think that is the next challenge and the opportunity. I still, I guess, remain hopeful that can be true.
John, does Stanford think they need to provide a balance to the liberal bias that typically exists at major universities?
Does Stanford think that?
Yeah.
I'm not Stanford anymore.
I know, but you're the next question.
Look, I do think that it is a shame that we don't have more of a balance, and that we should try to achieve more of a balance. I don't exactly how you get there is unclear. I think that we as a university are very, very fortunate that we have Hoover here, and they do provide somewhat of a balance, or more of a balance than certain other institutions. But yes, I think we should have a balance, because it's the Trump election was a very interesting, I think, example where people in academia, particularly Stanford, which is a bubble, sort of a liberal progressive bubble inside a liberal progressive bubble inside another one. I mean, we really are in a very pretty homogeneous place intellectually. And I think the fact that we were so completely taken off guard when Trump won, that's a sign of how out of touch we are with other viewpoints in the country. So I got, right after the election, I got an email message from a Stanford employee who telecommutes, and she lives in, I believe it's Indiana, and for reasons I won't go into, she telecommutes, and she said, the surprise that I see happening at Stanford, if people lived on my block, they would not be surprised. If people talked to my neighbors, they would not be surprised. They would also not be, they would understand what exactly happened. But of course, we don't live on her block in Indiana. We live in a very liberal community. So yes, I do think we should have balance. We should have more balance.
Boy, I've only got one question left, I think, and there's just so many good questions here. All right, this one I'm just going to read. I haven't even read it to the end, but let's try it, Claude. You get the last words. It's possible to have a strong institutional norm of free expression and still find intellectual homogeneity because of social norms and the tenure process, among other things. Is free speech sufficient for heterogeneity? Is it necessary?
Well, I think it's necessary. Free speech is necessary for balance and the like. But the question is whether those other processes, tenure and the like, homogenize even in the face of yeah. I think they can, and I think we need to be concerned about that in the ways that John was just mentioning. Tenure is is a decision that is made in an individual's discipline, not entirely within the university, because you're writing letters all over the world to get a review of the quality of this person's scholarship or science of some sort. So you're bringing in a lot of perspectives. That brings in, you'd like to think, some diversity, but if that discipline doesn't have adequate diversity, then you're not getting into the decision basket, the things that you would need to be that way. So I do think, even in the face of that we need to look at all of our practices this way. If you were coming into the university from the outside as a consultant, looking at it as an organization, what would you say about how you should improve your processes and how those processes contribute to something you're not in favor of? So I think we need to do a little bit of that kind of looking ourselves at what we do and how we behave and how we function. I mean, that may be one of the values of this moment, that we do develop a sort of meta sense about ourselves and try to examine things. Because I've had those kind of concerns.
Well, I would like to thank the audience. I want to apologize for the roughly 30 questions that I was not able to ask our panelists, but the ones that you did give were terrific. And then I'd really like to thank Danielle, Claude, John for a wonderful discussion. I know I learned a lot. Thank you very, very much.